Dr. Anthony Fauci, longtime director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, pioneer in the study of immunoregulation and work on HIV, member of the National Academy of Science and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, one of the most cited researchers of all time. Thank you so much for being with us today. And the subject that we'd like to talk with you with for this next little bit is something that is very much in the headlines, which is that of the Zika virus disease. This is, I think it's safe to say, a disease that nobody or virtually nobody in this audience had heard of too long ago, and yet now it's obviously in the headlines on a daily basis. We're lucky enough to be able to talk to you at this moment when this problem is not only popping up, but therefore communication about this problem is also paramount, and trying to get that right is extremely important. So very happy to have a chance to speak with you about that.
Okay. So how would we like to proceed?
Well, so I guess the way I'd like to start would be like this. Recent years, there have been a lot of different sorts of big emerging disease stories that have been in and out of the news. There was Ebola, MERS, different worries about bird flu over the years, SARS, Zika virus in some respects is sort of the latest exotic, frightening disease that people hadn't heard of before. So there's a lot of concern about this that has suddenly come out because of the reports, but also I think a lot of uncertainty for some people about how concerned to be and what kind of priority to start to be. I mean, I will ask the question which the answer is always no, which is panic in order?
Well, panic is never in order, but let me just start off by saying that Zika virus is really part of a spectrum of things that have been going on for a very long period of time, are going on right now, and will always go on. And that is the emergence and reemergence of either brand new infections that we've never seen or heard of before. And I think the classic mother of all new infectious diseases was the appearance of HIV/AIDS to our recognition, at least in the summer of 1981. And then there's the reemergence of infections that have been around, but they appear in different places, in different forms, and in different ways. And that falls under the broad spectrum of emerging and reemerging infections. There's a lot of different types of emerging and reemerging infections. Some are just curiosities. They're a little blip on the radar screen. They don't have major public health implications. And then every once in a while, you get a new or reemerging infection that has serious implications. And it's just very interesting that over the last several years, we've had a cluster of them that have gained the attention of the media, have had some impact on the United States, but impact less than the concern and panic that we've had about it. So no sooner did I devote about a year and a half of my life to Ebola, then we had a little breather, and now all of a sudden we have Zika, which is the same general category of unanticipated, unexpected emergence of a new infection. And that's what we have with Zika right now. I wrote an article just about a month ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the title was Zika virus infection, yet another arbovirus infection in the Western Hemisphere. Because if you look just in our own geographic location, in the last 10 or so years, we've had the emergence, or 20 years, we've had the emergence of dengue, which has been in South America and the Caribbean for a while, but has really exploded in a much more active way over the last 10 to 15 years. We've had West Nile that was never in the United States and came back in 1999. We had chikungunya, which was never in the Western Hemisphere, which is now devastating parts of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. And now we have Zika, which is a brand new surprise. Now, Zika would normally have been, you said nobody in the audience had heard of Zika. That's not surprising at all. Zika's been around, was first recognized in 1947 that's where it got its name, in the Zika forest of Uganda. Was recognized to infect anybody, any human, until 1952, and it kind of was like underneath the radar screen. And understandably, nobody paid much attention to it because it's a relatively mild infection. You get some arthralgias, arthritis, myalgias, conjunctivitis, a rash, and it goes away. It lasts about 5 days, and you're done. So we thought. And then when you had the outbreak in a massive place like South America and Brazil, the association with congenital abnormalities, if the mother gets infected during pregnancy, is now an area of great concern. And the thing about Zika right now that's so important from a public awareness standpoint is that we don't know everything we're supposed to know or should know about Zika. It's evolving right before our eyes. And I made a comment to the press a couple of weeks ago, and I'll say it again today. The more we learn, the worse it gets in the sense of what we're learning about what this virus can do. So if it were just in the issue of South America, the Caribbean, and Central America, there wouldn't be that much concern on the part of the United States. There would be empathy of the people who are suffering from it, but there wouldn't necessarily be concern about how does that impact us. The only issue is, and we won't know about that fully for a while, is that the very conditions that lead to a Zika outbreak do exist, certainly in certain parts of the United States, because it's a flavivirus. It's transmitted by an Aedes aegypti mosquito, which we have in our country, particularly along the southeastern Gulf Coast and a little bit up the East Coast. There's no doubt that we have that. So we have the ingredients of the possibility of having at least local transmission. I'm not so sure we're going to get, in fact, I don't think we will, but you never say never in this, massive outbreak, because we've had local outbreak of dengue and chikungunya in Florida and Texas, and it was always suppressed by good mosquito control. So we're hoping that if we do get local spread, it will be very, very restricted. But we don't know that yet. We're going to have to wait and see until we get to the mosquito season.
So, the understanding of the virus and its effects, obviously the pathologies associated with it, we've been evolving very rapidly in these past few months, partly through better understanding, I guess, of the epidemiology and also of the nature of the virus within its hosts. I think certainly when the reports were first coming out, there was some level of real uncertainty about whether or not this virus was actually responsible for the microcephaly, the smaller heads among newborns that was being seen. And now there seems to be much more certainty about that. How did we get from a point of real uncertainty to greater certainty now?
Well, it's just the evolving accumulation of evidence. So when you're dealing with phenomenon of association doesn't necessarily mean cause-effect. It could be temporally, geographically associated. There could be other factors. But as we gain more and more information, it's becoming much clearer and much more compelling that there is a direct causal relationship between the virus infecting the fetus of a pregnant woman and causing not only microcephaly, but other types of defects. And I'll get into that in a second, because I think microcephaly is really the tip of the iceberg on this, because that's a gross, easily recognizable abnormality. There almost certainly is always associated a percentage of more subtle abnormalities that you don't detect until maybe after birth, when you look like you have a normal child, and then you have developmental problems. The evidence of causality is shown by two major epidemiological phenomenon. One of them is a case-controlled study, and the other one is a cohort study. And the data that came out just a few weeks ago, in my mind, is very compelling. And it was a study from Brazil in which they had two cohorts of pregnant women, one who were infected with Zika and one group that was not infected with Zika. And they followed them with Doppler ultrasonography of the fetus in the womb. And they found out that among the individual pregnant women who were infected with Zika, 29% of them had gross recognizable abnormalities in the fetus, and 0% of the women who were uninfected and pregnant had it. That's pretty compelling evidence. The next issue is that if you look at what we're starting to see of evidence that's dribbling in, whenever you have an infection in a region of the world where there's a lot of travel, you will always have travel-related cases in the United States. There's a fact that very few people realize, but there are about 40 million people per year go back and forth between the United States and Central, South America, and the Caribbean. 40 million people a year. Among those, there are several 100,000 pregnant women. So what we're going to see and already are seeing are travel-related cases. So if you look at the map of the United States, in some populated states like California, there are several hundred people who come in and will have travel-related cases. What we haven't seen so far is local transmitted Zika in the United States. So travel means I go to Pernambuco or a place in Brazil, I get bit by a mosquito, I come back to Washington and I get sick with Zika. That's a travel-related case. If I come back and get sick and a mosquito bites me and then bites you, but you never left, that's a locally acquired case. We have seen locally acquired cases of dengue over the years, so we know it can happen in Florida and Texas, and we've seen locally acquired cases of chikungunya in Florida. So I can tell you right now, because I'm going to be having to be explained it to the press maybe several hundred times when it happens, is that we will unquestionably have a local acquired case in the United States. It likely will be in the southeastern part of the country in the Gulf Coast, but it will happen. The trick is going to be how we handle it. And the way we've been able to prevent dengue and chikungunya from going from local transmitted to very much disseminated, sustained transmission is by very aggressive mosquito control. Now, since every week that goes by we learn more about this, we're not sanguine or confident and say it will never happen. I don't think you're going to see disseminated, sustained Zika in the United States, but it is quite possible that it will happen, and that's the reason why we have to be prepared for it.
Right, and so that is one unknown that surrounds a lot of this, and of course the other part of the unknown, as you mentioned, is that we still don't know the full spectrum of the kind of pathologies that may be associated with this.
Well, I'm actually concerned about that because, I mean, if you look at the history of congenital abnormalities, this is very, very similar to the issue of congenital rubella, which we saw in the United States. People don't appreciate, either they don't remember, or given the youth of our nation, they weren't even born yet. In the 1960s, there were about 20,000 cases of congenital rubella syndrome per year. 20,000 per year. So we're talking about 5,000 Zika congenital abnormalities in Brazil, and understandably, people are getting very excited about that. But there were 20,000 congenital rubella in the United States. And the reason it happened is because, in a very analogous way, rubella as a disease is not a really very serious disease. You know, people don't generally die from rubella, and they don't really get very sick. The same thing with Zika. So what happened before we had a vaccine for rubella is that most of the children would get infected when they were children. But a certain percentage of unlucky, mostly girls, didn't get infected when they were children. And then when they became of childbearing age and they got pregnant, they were unlucky enough to get infected during pregnancy, and that's how you get congenital rubella syndrome. And for that reason, the vaccine was developed for rubella. You wouldn't necessarily need a vaccine for rubella because it's not a very serious disease, except it was originally developed for women of childbearing age. Now, the easiest way to get women of childbearing age protected is to vaccinate everybody when they're children and infants, and then by the time that they're childbearing age, they're protected. That's probably what's going to happen with Zika when we get a vaccine, and I think we will ultimately get a vaccine for Zika. The question is, you know, how fast you can do it, because what you need to do with Zika is really protect pregnant women. That's the target population, because if you put pregnant women aside, apart from some cases of Guillain-Barré, which you see after, you know, a number of viral infections and GI bacterial infections, it isn't a terribly serious disease. So we have to focus on protecting pregnant women.
One of the things also, you mentioned the huge number of people who move back and forth between the United States and down into Latin America. And of course, one of the things that has been a specter hanging over this is the issue of the Olympics coming up.
Right.
And that's obviously decisions about whether or not it would affect people going to the Olympics or the conduct of the games. Obviously, hugely economic, influential, and otherwise. Any thoughts about that?
A few thoughts. So there's some misunderstanding about that, and I think if you read an interview of an Olympic athlete in the Washington Post a couple of days ago who was concerned about going to South America, I think there's a little bit confusion. If you're not pregnant and you're not going to be pregnant, then you really don't have any particular issue about going to the Olympics or not. That's for a woman. So obviously, the recommendations of the CDC, which are important, that if you are pregnant, think you might be pregnant or going to get pregnant, don't travel to a region with Zika. That's a very important recommendation. The situation gets confounded and complicated by a couple of things. One, we now know, as if each day something new is, that this is sexually transmitted also, because the virus in men sequesters in the semen. We don't know yet what percentage of men who are infected have virus that persists in the semen after they clear virus from the blood. We don't know what that percentage is. We know it happens. It's been well documented. We don't know how long it stays in the semen. There's a report that says it can go out to 62 days. Whether or not that's live virus or that's just remnants of virus that are not live, we don't know. Therefore, that's why the recommendation, and this is an important recommendation because it's a bit subtle and people may not get it, that if you're a man and you go to the region, 80% of the infections are asymptomatic. So you may not know you get infected. 20% of them are symptomatic. So to really be safe, if you're a man and you go to a region where there's Zika, you should assume that you may have been infected. And therefore, when you come back to the United States, if you have a pregnant wife, a pregnant girlfriend, that you should either refrain from sex, which doesn't happen, or you can use the correct and consistent use of a condom for the duration of the pregnancy. Now, duration of the pregnancy is interesting because most congenital abnormalities that are associated with viral infections of a woman occur in the first trimester. To our surprise and chagrin, we find out that now women who are infected in the second and even the third trimester can have problems with fetuses getting congenital abnormalities. So if you're going to protect the person you're having sex with, your wife or your girlfriend who's pregnant, you should really make sure, if you were in the region, to have consistent and correct use of condoms. The next thing that's not confusing, that's confounding, is that we also know it's spread by blood transfusions. We didn't realize that until recently, that the virus stays in the blood and you could transfuse it when you get a blood donation. So right now, the FDA and the American Red Cross are coming out with recommendations about voluntary self-deferral, as well as developing a test to be able to screen the blood. Right now, today, the situation in Puerto Rico is so difficult because there are now local transmission in Puerto Rico that if you need a blood transfusion in Puerto Rico, they're not using local blood. They're shipping in blood from the mainland because they're afraid that they'll propagate the outbreak just by blood transfusion. So that's a difficult situation right there.
What about the case of women who may not know that they are pregnant, weren't planning on getting pregnant, but then find that they've gone into an infected zone, and then they return later and discover that they are pregnant? I mean, that's also could be a considerable number of women too.
Well, yeah. Well, there's two aspects of that are important. There's the anxiety associated with not knowing whether you're infected, and you find out that you're pregnant, you're there, but we keep talking about women who are here and going there. Let's not forget about the unfortunate women who live there,
sure, right,
and have to deal with this all the time. I mean, that's something we tend to forget because we only think a little provincially about ourselves. There are so many women there who are at risk and at danger. But take the case that you mentioned. That's the reason why we're struggling to get a very specific diagnostic test. One of the confounding issues, there are a lot, I've used the word confounding multiple times today, but because it is confounding, is that the diagnostic test for the infection itself is very specific and very easy. It's a molecular test called PCR. That's the good news. The sobering news is that the virus only stays in the blood for a relatively short period of time. So the question pregnant women, either those who know they're pregnant or who didn't know they were pregnant and want to know if they're infected, is, was I infected when I was down there or not? And you can determine that by an antibody test. The difficulty is the antibody test as it exists today, and we're working on getting one that's more specific, cross-reacts with other flaviviruses. So if you've been living in Brazil for years, the likelihood is that you've gotten exposed to dengue infection. And if you do an antibody test, you can't tell whether you've been infected with dengue or whether you've been infected with Zika or both. And there's a secondary test that very few labs do that can determine that. So you can find out if you are infected. And then if you do, then the recommendation is to follow the pregnancy with sonograms to determine if you're dealing with a situation where you're having a developmental abnormality, and then the choices that come up are an individual choice for the woman involved. The only difficulty with that is that some of those tests are not particularly sensitive, and you don't know if there's a problem until very late. And if it's very late, then you have your options of how you're going to deal with that become less and less.
For all the reasons that you detailed, there's a lot of grist for anxiety that the public could have in hearing about that. A lot of different sorts of unknowns, a lot of sorts of cryptic things about the development of how this could go. What would be your greatest concerns about a public that is not processing this information well, about the worst kinds of reactions that they could have to this?
Well, the worst kinds of reaction almost certainly is going to happen, and that is that people are going to, based on either misinformation or lack of interpretation of correct information, is that there's going to be anxiety associated with the evolving situation that will create a good deal of concern and possibly even panic on the part of some people, and that's the reason why we in the public health sector have to be very, very crystal clear in articulating what the risks are and what the risks are not. I think if you look at what happened with the anxiety, almost all of which was ill-founded with regard to Ebola, you know, when we had one person who came over from Liberia, got infected and was in a hospital in Texas, and 2 nurses got infected, that there was a panic that there was going to be a major outbreak of Ebola in the United States, and there was virtually no chance that would happen. You don't want to be overconfident, but it's very unlikely that would happen. I think when we first start seeing locally transmitted cases in the United States, we're going to have to do a lot of educating of the public as to what the risk is and what the risk is not, because that's always the case. It's very interesting in the general public when they are confronted with a new risk. So we live in a world, in a society where we take risks every day. When you've been taking a risk every day for the last 20 or 30 years, you kind of live with the risk and it doesn't bother you. It's very interesting. When you superimpose upon that a new risk, even if the new risk is much, much, much less than the risk that you've been living with for 2 years, we have trouble integrating the concept of relative risk. So if a new risk comes in, immediately you consider that the most important risk in your life, and you focus in on that. And that's what we saw with Ebola. That's what we saw here in Washington with the anthrax attacks. And that's what we're almost certainly going to see with Zika. So you've got to make sure you put into perspective. And I used to tell people when they were worried about that back in, Ebola, for example. People say, should I be worried about Ebola right here in Washington, D.C.? Because we admitted a couple of patients that I took care of at the NIH Clinical Center with Ebola. And the question I always got asked, my goodness, are you putting us at great risk? So I would just ask them, how did you get to work in the morning? Well, I got on the Beltway and I drove to the NIH. That was a better risk, a worse risk than getting Ebola.
Well, Andy, let me ask this quickly on what I hope is a hopeful note, and then I just want to open things up for some questions as you may have. What do you think are our best prospects for how we are going to end up dealing with this? Will we be working on the mosquitoes?
Sure.
Will we develop a vaccine against the virus?
I think the immediate approach is going to be mosquito control, and that can be done by a number of ways, including just getting rid of still water particularly in environments in which, particularly poorer environments economically, where you have water in pots and pans and tires and in pools. The other is by insecticides, environmentally friendly insecticides and larvicides, protecting yourself with insect repellents, staying in areas that are screened and air conditioned. That's the immediate approach. The ultimate approach is going to be a vaccine. And as in many diseases, vaccine essentially solves your problem. If we get a safe and effective vaccine for Zika, which I hope we will, and we're going to be starting a phase 1 trial in September of this year, that means just beginning in trials in humans, and then we'll go into more advanced trial probably in 2017. That to me is going to be the ultimate answer. Because if you can protect people, then you get not only individual protection, but then you get herd immunity, where you don't get an outbreak because there's so much immunity in the community.
Good. Let me just turn to this. There's a yes. Yes, this gentleman here, I think. Oh, sorry. Hi. Yes. If you just to take the microphone and just
Thank you.
Say who you are, just for.
Marshall Matz. Doctor, you didn't mention genetic engineering as a possible intervention. The public is not very confident in genetic engineering, but I know that the FDA currently has a 30-day comment period available for the use of genetic engineering to modify mosquitoes.
Right.
Given the lack of confidence in the public's mind about sound science, which the first panel discussed at some great length, would you advise all of us that care about sound science to comment in that rulemaking?
About genetic engineering of mosquitoes?
Yeah.
Well, the situation with genetic engineering of mosquitoes is such that there's always a concern about genetically modifying anything, so there's going to be a considerable amount of pushback. But even at best, it depends on what genetic modification. There's one in which you get sterile male mosquitoes and you let them out in the population, and they will mate with females, and then their larvae will not survive. The ability to implement that on a large scale is very, very difficult because you would have to release mosquitoes over a very broad geographic area. Mosquitoes have a range of maximum of about 200 meters. So a mosquito that's released here, that's genetically modified, is not going to make it to 15th Street. So you're going to have to be doing the releases all along. So I think it's promising if we can do it. We're going to have a lot of obstacles about people who are concerned about genetic modification, but I'm not so sure it's practical from the standpoint of having an impact on all of Brazil or all of Colombia.
We're going to have a chance to actually revisit this topic.
Dr.
Federoff, you want to? Yes.
Hi, Tony. I'm just finishing an editorial with former Secretary of Agriculture Jack Block that describes exactly that kind of an eradication program that was conducted from the 1950s through the late 1970s on screwworm. The genetically modified mosquito, there is a lot of skepticism that it's scalable, but we have drones now.
Right.
Right now, what they're doing over fairly large areas is doing what Google Maps does, right? Driving along, little puff of air,
Right.
the mosquito gets out. I think, and this is why we're publishing this, that this is the kind of crisis that we need to take a more global view.
Right.
You've made the very cogent point that 40 million people travel back and forth. This mosquito carries chikungunya, West Nile virus, dengue, as well as Zika. Hemisphere-wide eradication programs based on insecticides have not worked. They've kind of made some progress and then fallen back. It's time to try the biological approach.
No, I agree.
And I think that
Yeah.
we really need to put effort into it.
And I'm funding it to a considerable amount of money.
let me just interrupt you because I know we will get a chance to revisit some of this in just a little
I
more
agree.
when you and I are speaking again later. Any other? Yes, this here.
Hi, my name is Jessica Meisinger. I'm with the National Renderers Association. I'm a scientist. I'm the daughter of scientists, so I've always seen myself as being pretty understanding of risk. Went through the whole mad cow thing. You're way more likely to die choking on a hamburger than to ever die of anything related to mad cow. But this one's hit me differently, as I'm a woman of childbearing age who very unluckily started planning a wedding in Puerto Rico in August.
Yes.
I don't know what to do, and we're getting kind of differing information as it goes. It sort of feels like we should wear no mosquito repellent, hope we get it, and then hope we're better off in 6 months. I'm just hoping there's more information before August, but I'm experiencing this in a very different way than I have other things, because it's hitting a lot closer to home.
Yeah. And I think that probably you are very, very representative of large numbers of people who find themselves dealing with that. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because someone asked me at a lecture I gave last night about why is Zika such a big deal when there's so many other things in the world that can cause disease and harm. There really is something very special about a pregnant woman, mother, and the possibility of harming a helpless, innocent fetus that just goes to a different level of concern that is an emotional response that's superimposed upon a real concern. I mean, that's really based in reality. The idea about, I'd be happy to talk to you on the side about what you should do in August in Puerto Rico, but we'll save that for later. Right?
Oh, that's great. Again, sadly, I regret that we have to move things along just because of how full our program here is today. But I have to say, I think we are immensely lucky to have had the benefit of your communication about the state of what we understand with this, which has been so clear, and I hope deeply informative, if not always deeply reassuring for everyone. But thank you very much. Real pleasure having you here. Tony Fauci.